For the people who don't understand anything about PRI, can you give us like a quick dummy course? Sure. PRI 101, like what's the deal?
So if you were to imagine that, let's go back to what we said about, we have a heart on the left, we have a liver on the right, we have a diaphragm that is asymmetrical. So just in that context, we understand that our trunk has certain asymmetries. So because of these asymmetries, our brain is also asymmetrical. We have a better ability to have higher dexterity on the right side of our body. So you would probably figure with that in mind that most people would probably be right-handed. So given that, and all these factors, the fact that like if we have ourselves divided down the middle vertically, we would weigh a little bit more on our right side. So because of these factors, and it's all a variety of influences, but because of them, we are going to probably load into our right side a little bit better. So for example, on a squat descent, you mentioned the force place and how most people would have more weight on their right foot. Mm-hmm. That's a largely influenced outcome of this asymmetry and how we load into our right side better. And the opposite inverse effect on our left side is we can push out of it better. And that's because our left side is in a state of propulsion more so than the right side. The right hip is in more of this orientation where it's backwards more. The right hip is back and the left hip tends to be more forward, which is why a lot of people like to shift to the right when load gets really heavy in a squat. And they like to jump off of their left leg a lot of times, regardless of the fact of they're right or left-handed. Yeah. Now that can play into it, but that's not necessarily separate from the fact that you're asymmetrical.
Yeah, that's what we see with almost every basketball player is you're actually stronger weight room wise on your right. Mm-hmm. If you jump, you're bilaterally, you're going to get more out of your right. From a standing position, sometimes you jump better from your right, but from a running position, always better from the left.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's really interesting how that works. And it's not like it's almost always. It's like 90% of the time. Yeah. But there's always somebody had a bad ankle sprain on one side and like you've mentioned before, okay, you're shifting away from that. And so now you're getting into entirely different patterns. But go on in our PRI 101 course.
Sure. I think you hit a really good point there about how you mentioned like, well, what if someone isn't in this? Like, what if someone presents as something that's different? And
what percentage of people would you say that you see are not in this pattern?
I would say people start off there a lot of the times, and there are individual differences that exist within people. I'm not trying to say every human being's like this and it's only this way. There are differences. And so I would say when I assess someone, I would say probably about 75% of people will present that meets the expectations of this individual pattern. Mm-hmm. That is this right side dominance. We can load our right hip better, push out of our left better. When we can do that, let's imagine now that right hip is back and that left hip is forward. What's your upper body going to do? Well, your body is trying to be balanced, right? It's not trying to be all over on the right side, because if your trunk turned to the right side too, you would probably walk in a circle to the right. So in order for us to balance that and counterbalance, we're going to relatively bring our right shoulder forward and down, because that means our trunk is rotating slightly to the left. But that doesn't mean we're literally turning and, it's like this big disaster. It's just now a little bit of turn is happening to allow us to balance ourselves out. Because the pelvis, I'm making these big movements with my hands, but that's just for the purposes of illustration. Really what's happening is it's a very slight rotation, and it's a very slight rotation forward, and it's a very slight rotation of the right shoulder coming forward. So I'd encourage people when they're just walking down the street, when they're seeing people stand in a social circle and just talking, look at how many people are standing more on their right leg. Look at how many people have a lower right shoulder.
Dude, the lower right shoulder, you can't unsee it. Every airport I go to now, it's like, right shoulder droop constantly. And before I never looked at that. And now I'm always looking at that right shoulder, and you just see it. It's so common.
It's so common, man. Also, other things to look out for is look at when people run, when your athletes sprint, look at them spend more time landing on the rear foot relative to the forefoot on the left. People love to strike the ground on more of their relative back foot on the right. That doesn't mean they're slapping the ground with their heel, but they're going to land a little bit more on the right midfoot and a little bit further forward on the left forefoot. Yeah. And that's that representation of the left pelvis being a little bit forward. You can utilize that glute to push a little bit more forward on the left.
That's what we're seeing with the pressure mapping stuff. We're starting to get a lot of the pro dunkers to do the pressure mapping, and we're seeing where the pressure's at throughout the jump and kind of studying the different phases. And very early on the left side, they become forefoot dominant, while the right is actually still down. They want to keep that full ground contact for as long as possible. Yeah. But the left, it's like it comes off the heel as soon as possible and comes to the forefoot.
Definitely. I think that's why those force plates are such a good tool, because you can literally show people that this is a thing, because you could tell people this all day and they're like, like, is this really a thing? Right. And then you show them on an objective force plate measurement, like, oh yeah, now I really see what's going on here.
Totally.
So I think it's a great tool, but not everyone has a force plate. Mm-hmm. So there are different things that we can do to show people that they're asymmetrical. Like different things you can do is just a basic straight leg raise test. Like have someone lay on their back, have them pull one leg up. Most people do not have a symmetrical test result when they do that. You can measure things like hip flexion. You can have someone, the best way I like to do it with someone is just have them do a body weight squat for tempo. 5 seconds down, 5 seconds up. Have them do 10 reps just like that. I guarantee you on the 7th, 8th, 9th rep, you're going to see that hip shift to the left or the right, mostly the right in a lot of people, but you will oftentimes see sometimes a left hip shift. And we call that usually an additional compensation built on top of this pattern, because we've been living on this earth for, decades, right? And so if there's demands that are imposed on us that cause us to need to compensate to find a range of motion we don't have, then you're probably going to see compensations built up. And that's why I haven't seen one person ever that fits 100% strict of this PRI calls it the left AIC pattern, because everyone has different lifestyle demands. Everyone has different sport demands, and that's going to result in compensations. But I don't think that means those compensations are bad. I just think that those compensations happen because the body's trying to do what it needs to do to accomplish the task.
Right. Yeah, a lot of the best athletes are the best compensators. So it's not like everything they're doing is perfect. They're just better at other people than at compensating and figuring out a new movement solution based on the pattern that they're already in.
Definitely.
And then as far as like so you talk about the left AIC, how about the PEC?
Sure. Good question.
Because that's I know they kind of refer to that as like the strength syndrome, the strength and conditioning guy.
Yes.
And I know a lot of people lift weights who are listening to this. So I think that might be important to talk about.
Yeah. So I would just encourage everyone that's listening to this, think about the people that lift a lot of weights, are really athletic, and they, for whatever reason, they have like a forward pelvis where you see like that big low back arch. That's like an anterior pelvic tilt that most people would probably recognize that term. What that is usually
is Instagram pose, Instagram model pose.
Instagram pose.
All right. So for all the 18-year-old basketball players listening to this, how do Instagram models pose? Okay. That's the anterior tilt.
It's that. Push your butt out, arch your back. That's anterior tilt.
Yeah.
A lot of people live in a slight degree of that. And what that really is it's one of two things. Either that person has demands placed on their body where they need to extend their back. When you jump, you better be able to extend your back. You better be able to find a place of extension. When you're pushing through a heavy squat, you better be able to extend your back and find that extension. And that usually is the body just getting a lot of one thing. And then it becomes adapted to that one thing. So that person is in a state of extension and chronic extension. And then both sides of the pelvis come forward on both sides. But that doesn't mean that it's now symmetrical. It just now means that the left is still relatively forward, but it's now both sides are forward. And that can happen because that body is trying to find a propulsive state, because that body is living in more of a propulsive state. So what you might see is this person has more weight relatively on their toes, and then they might feel, oh man, my hamstrings are now a little bit tight. But really what that is it's like that post you made, what's really good representation of imagining that rope being pulled from both ends, that band being stretched from both ends. That's that tight hamstring. It's not necessarily a chronically short hamstring. The overwhelming majority of people, when they feel that hamstring tightness, it's because they're in that PEC. It's because both sides of the pelvis are now forward and that hamstring is now long, but it feels tight. But of course it would feel tight if you took your muscle and pulled it from both ends.